Thank you. Thanks very much, Zoe. So I think this is a very fitting addition to this, what I think of as the depression session this morning, because it's talking again about some major impacts that people have on the environment. And I just would like to start off by acknowledging my collaborators here. Many of you will know Wendy Collins, and she runs up our Wildlife and Roads project and has been doing so for a few years. I think 2 years ago we had a session here at the symposium on road ecology and the work that she was doing. And then Lizanne Roxburgh works in our science unit, and then Prof. Rodney van der Ree is a global guru when it comes to all things roads, and was one of the leads on this handbook of road ecology that was published a couple of years ago. So I think everybody knows that roads and human economic development are inextricably linked. Wherever people go, we make roads, and we make lots of them in all shapes and sizes. And I've always sort of thought this map gives a very startling indication of what kind of impact we're having on the planet. This is there a point? Oh, there. Does that work? Yeah. So what this map shows, it's basically all the roads across the planet that are buffered by 1 kilometre. And so you see areas up here where there's absolutely, no place untouched by roads. Luckily, we've got some sections in Africa that are fairly wide open, spaces that are not traversed by roads. But, roads would come with them a lot of other things. Over 750 million vehicles. There's more than 50 million kilometres of public road across the globe, and so that's 2,200 times around the equator in terms of this kind of infrastructure. And what they're predicting is that there's going to be about 25 million kilometres of new roads developed by 2050, and that the vast majority of that is going to be in developing nations. And here is another interesting, I think, bit of work that was done by Lawrence and colleagues, looking at road development and how it relates to agricultural potential. And if you can see on this chart here, what we've got on the moving to the dark, sort of the green areas, is where environmental values are higher, and this axis here is showing that agricultural potential is high up here. So what we can see is where there's dark areas is where there's a big conflict between agriculture and the environment. And the reason this is relevant for roads is because one of the main drivers of road building is to carry our stuff around, and agriculture is a big part of that. So 25% of Africa falls in this conflict category here. All these dark bits are areas where there's high biodiversity value, but also high agricultural value, and where we're going to have to be starting to make some decisions about planning. Here's another map, also by Lawrence, a different paper, looking at these big development corridors that are predicted to go up around Africa. They're going to crisscross across the continent, and the map shows all of these developments sort of bounded by a 50-kilometre wide band. And the purpose behind these developments is to improve agricultural production, mineral exports, to increase economic integration in the region. And there are currently 33 of these massive infrastructure projects that are either in progress or being planned, covering 53,000 kilometres. Part of the analysis was to look at how this was going to affect protected areas. These are crisscrossing 400 different protected areas and will potentially impact on 1,800 others. And the knock-on effect of this is that they are going to open up previously sparsely populated areas and give people access. So that's a big concern. When we talk about roads, I think people are generally familiar with the kinds of impacts that they have. There are direct impacts, the most obvious one being collisions, but also things like habitat and population fragmentation, and then there's pollution, noise, air, water, that kind of thing. But there are also indirect impacts. And so, as I mentioned, roads give people access to natural resources that are otherwise difficult to reach. They allow the spread of alien invasive species, of disease, And then there's also the things like climate change from vehicle emissions. And then on top of that, what are the interacting impacts, the cumulative impacts of all of these effects? And so the science of road ecology was first described by Foreman and Alexander in 1998, which seems actually very recent. And it's essentially the study of the ecological impacts, both positive and negative, of transportation, and looking at things like local effects, noise, water pollution, and that kind of thing, and then the broader effects. And the idea behind this discipline is to provide planners with advice on how to minimize or mitigate the negative environmental impacts of transportation. And it's a very multidisciplinary field. Ecologists, biologists, hydrologists, engineers, economists. We need a lot of expertise to really understand these quite complex issues. And so we got together, and part of Wendy's work has been to do a lot of, I suppose, field work, looking at where are animals getting impacted. I know one of her field sites was up in Limpopo, but we thought, let's try and take a bit more of a bird's eye view about what's going on with road ecology in Africa. And so we asked the questions: what road ecology research has been done, since when, where has it been done, and is it relevant for decision making and policy formulation? And so what we did, we searched the ISI Web of Science database using some search terms. I won't read them out there, but essentially looking at Africa, any country in Africa, and then a whole bunch of terms that are relevant to road infrastructure and linear infrastructure. And we included all the peer-reviewed papers we could find that were in English, excluding grey literature, and we first of all screened them by title and keywords and did a typical literature search. And then when we found stuff that was relevant, we went into the reference lists and looked to see if we could find anything more that we might have missed. And we categorized all of these studies by a number of different things. We looked at the aims of the study, what type of study it was done, where it was done, what were the focal biodiversity components, were they looking at any direct biodiversity impacts or indirect impacts, what was the study design, and were they testing any interventions? And so we started from a list of just almost 6,000 papers and whittled these down to 204 papers on studies across the African continent that were relevant to road ecology. And of these papers, just over 80% of them were actually data papers. They collected empirical information, and there were a few reviews, and there were some conceptual studies, and then there sort of a combination of all of them. And as we kind of predicted, the number of road ecology relevant studies has increased over time. The first case that we could come across was a paper published in 1954. But in recent years, certainly in the last decade or so, there's been an increasing attention paid to this field of work. And when you look at the geographic coverage of this across Africa, this is for 193 of those papers that were specifically working in a particular region. By far the majority have been done in South Africa, 63, if I'm not, 63. Fairly good widespread. The grey shows areas with no studies at all, and certainly up into North Africa, very, very limited work has been done. All right, and then we looked at the scope of the work, and as I mentioned before, we've got direct effects and indirect effects. So, there seemed to be sort of an even spread between these two sort of broad categories, and we were looking at things like mortality due to collision, roadside as habitat, road crossing behavior. Those are all the direct effects. But the indirect ones were where papers were looking at things like species distributions in relation to road networks and that kind of thing, or whether roads had caused landscape level change. And then also this very important one here, which I think everyone is sort of intuitively familiar with, is in terms of bushmeat poaching and sort of access to things like hardwoods and stuff. And when you broke it down, we looked at species, what species the studies have been looking at. By far the majority were vertebrates. Not that much on veg and inverts. And when we break the invertebrates up, we look and we see that most of the studies have been on mammals, which is also not very surprising. One startling thing that we found is that of the 204 papers that we looked at, only 5 only 2.5% actually tested any interventions. And these, if you look at, I've listed them here because there's so few, looking at road signage to reduce collisions, canopy bridges for primates, temporary barriers to inhibit movements of western leopard toads, the influence of tire pressure on off-road soil compaction, and fence gaps to contain rhinos but allow movement of other species. All right, so I think most of those were done in South Africa. And the question is, are those the kinds of papers that we should be doing? Are we asking and answering the right questions? We think, okay, canopy bridges, a bit of collision, but we're looking at this massive, we're in the face of this massive onslaught of development across Africa. And these papers are not testing anything that's got any relevance, really, to how we design and mitigate the impacts of these big infrastructure projects. So what's next? We haven't finished our work. Certainly we have some key preliminary findings. First of all, there were more studies than we anticipated. We were expecting far fewer. And so we were quite surprised that there were 204. That there's been an increasing attention over time, and that there's also quite a big difference in effort geographically and thematically. But that there's really, at the moment, I think, little relevance for actual implementation of any kind of mitigation. And so what our next steps are is to look at trying to categorize some of the recommendations from these studies and see if there are any gaps that are important. There are definitely gaps, but look to try and understand what these gaps are and how we can fill them. And there's lots of different ways of classifying, and I think at the moment our thoughts are to take two different approaches. One is to actually look at the types of recommendations that are being made. So, this is just one sort of taxonomy of things, but we could look at, are recommendations being made about protection and management, or law and policy, education and awareness, that kind of thing. So what suggestions are actually being made by these papers in terms of the sort of the topic of road ecology. But the second way that we can look at the recommendations from these papers is the quality of the recommendations. So we also want to kind of find a way of classifying so we can see, are people doing randomized replicated controlled designs, or are they just sort of stating very vaguely at the end of a paper that roads shouldn't go through forests because they might impact, through bushmeat poaching. So is it something that's based on evidence from a paper, or is it something that is just you could have guessed before you even went out and did the work? And so I think our approach now is to take both of those and try to see what comes out of that. And that's going to be going a long way to informing our approach for how we want to take our program forward. It's certainly been a very useful exercise. And if anyone's got any great ideas about what else we can do to sort of eke the most out of this set of papers and literature, I'd be very keen to hear it. Thanks very much, everyone.